Hi, I'm Angus Gillespie, Professor of American Studies at Rutgers University, and our show is called Old Ways in New Jersey. With a history of religious tolerance, New Jersey has welcomed many denominations to its shores over time. However, when we think of religion in New Jersey, we typically think in terms of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. We seldom think of Islam in New Jersey, yet it is very much with us. To help us understand what it means to be a Muslim American, we have in our studio today Sylvia Chan-Malik, an East Brunswick resident and a professor at Rutgers who's done extensive research on this question. Sylvia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. You studied at Berkeley, so I presume you grew up in California, is that correct?
I did. I am a Northern California Bay Area native, born and raised in the Berkeley, Oakland area. So I did my undergraduate at Berkeley, and then I went on to do my graduate work there as well.
Wow, all the way.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of religion, did you grow up Muslim?
No, I grew up in a very, kind of, I guess you could kind of say just a grab bag. My parents are immigrants from China. My mother's from a little colony called Macau, which is a colony of Portugal.
Right.
And my father is from the south of China. And so they kind of, they were your kind of, standard immigrants. They came to the United States. They absorbed a lot of the cultures. They kind of translated them into how they understood them to be. Like, I had to tell them what to put in the stocking at Christmas, and they put like a red envelope, so things like that. I mean, that was the kind of upbringing. Religion was part of it because my mother was raised in Catholic schools, but it was not something that was very present in my life.
And they weren't really Buddhist, particularly?
I mean, there were, again, like little things, like we would do ceremonies and things like that when people passed away or at Chinese New Year. But again, it was much more cultural and not a religious practice so much.
But I assume it was like driven by Confucius, things like respecting the ancestors.
Oh, well, that, that's just, culturally in terms of those types of things. And I had a very large extended family, so all these things were enforced from different people at all times.
Yeah. So when did you become Muslim?
Well, it was kind of an interesting conversion of my scholarly interests and what I was feeling at the time. I started studying Islam because of political activism I was involved in after 9/11. I had been very involved in working with African American and Asian American communities in the Bay Area at that time, working in the public schools and stuff. And after 9/11, there was this kind of outpouring of emotion around that event, of course, as you know. And there was also violence that was directed at Muslim and Arab communities.
And even misdirected at Sikhs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just anyone that was perceived as perhaps, associated with the people who perpetrated these acts of violence. And so at that time, I became involved with organizations that were working to advocate against this type of racial profiling, this type of stereotyping. And as I started to do that, I started to get involved with the people, kind of getting to know, well, what is Islam and what are the tenets of the faith? And just having really, being very intellectually interested in it, and eventually coming to meet a group of people that I respected deeply and admired deeply, and always having been interested in religion and spirituality. It was just something that kind of fit into my life and became a part of it at that time.
So would it be fair to say that you're sort of a participant observer, that you're both within it and objective about it?
I mean, I would definitely say that because I still, feel very culturally Chinese, you know? I mean, whatever that means, in terms of food choices and things like that. So, it's an interesting relationship that I have. I definitely am involved with the Muslim community, have been in California, here, but I also, can kind of step out and put on my scholar hat, and try to do my work from that perspective of not having grown up in it or something like that.
I read at the present time, in terms of religion, Islam is something like 1% in the U.S. That's about right?
Right. So that's the one issue that's been very difficult for scholars of Islam in the United States to figure out, because there are no census calculations for religion. So the estimate is that yes, the numbers are low, anywhere from 1 to 2% at the present moment. But that's because you have also a lot of people who might not say, "Oh, I'm Muslim." But they might be affiliated with a family, or who counts as Muslim. Like if you don't say your prayers, but if you celebrate the holidays, like it's kind of the same question that Jews, like if you're talking about secular Jews, would be dealing with. Like, who counts as a Muslim? And so that kind of makes it very difficult to account for demographics.
Well, even though the numbers are tiny, there's a long history of Islam in America, is there not?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you fill us in just a little bit on that?
Sure. I mean, and so this is a history that's been becoming much more prominent after 9/11. People became very interested in, where exactly did Islam, come to be what it is in the United States? Why do we associate it with certain ideas of terrorism and women's rights and et cetera? So actually, the very first Muslims in the United States came from West Africa, and they were slaves that were brought here through the slave trade. And some scholars have estimated that perhaps up to a third of the African slaves that came to the U.S. were from predominantly Muslim region in West Africa called Senegambia. So that's an estimate. It goes anywhere from 1/5 to 1/3. So there was a very strong presence of Islamic practices among slave communities. Now, most of those were mostly wiped out because of enforced Christianity, because of kind of the violence and awfulness of slavery. So those kind of practices mostly died out by the end of the 19th century. In the early 20th century, with the great migration north of African Americans following the Civil War, you see a resurgence of
Highway 61 from Mississippi to
Chicago.
Exactly,
to Chicago, to Detroit, to New York even, to Philadelphia, places like this. There's this huge influx of African Americans coming into the north. And so there start to be these kind of new types of Islamic movements.
Almost storefront, almost.
In some ways, yeah. I mean, very sort of, in that time, too, of religion, kind of the idea of the storefront revival, with groups like the Moorish Science Temple, which was led by a man named Noble Drew Ali. Most people are familiar with the Nation of Islam, who was led by Elijah Muhammad and who Malcolm X was affiliated with for most of his life. So groups like this started to pop up in these urban centers, and African Americans were very drawn to these movements because they had very strong messages of kind of anti-racism and equality, and also, in the case of the Nation of Islam, black nationalism, where they kind of asserted, the desire to have a separate space for African American religion, culture, and even physically. So this was how Islam kind of had its resurgence in the 20th century.
Maybe in the black mind there was a notion that Christianity was associated with slave owners, and maybe this was a reaction in a way.
Right, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely true. If you look at the speeches and the words of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, they say exactly that.
So it's part of separatism in a sense.
Absolutely. They talked about Christianity as the white man's religion, as a slave religion that kept people enslaved in their minds. And Islam was a way of not only empowering oneself as an African American, but also linking themselves to an alternative community that was not kind of dictated by white privilege and white power within the U.S. at that time. They could connect themselves to a notion of the East, a universal religion. Yeah.
You mentioned a moment ago the Moorish Science Temple. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. The Moorish Science Temple was one of the earliest Islamic movements in the U.S. It was, I think, born in the first decade of the 1900s. And again, its founder was a man named Noble Drew Ali. And he was a very interesting and colorful figure. He drew a lot of the influences for the movement from kind of Shriner ideology, Moroccan fezzes. And what he did was he kind of took this mishmash of ideas, and he even edited and kind of changed around the words of the Quran in order to kind of make it fit more with that time, which is what Elijah Muhammad did and W.D. Farad did with the Nation of Islam as well. So a lot of people discount these early African American movements of Islam because they say that's not really Islam. Because they were doing, they were making changes.
Well, they were fascinated with the exoticism.
They were improvising. Yeah. I mean, there was also this kind of, easy travel between the U.S. and beyond. And there was a kind of notion of the East that was very present in the way they dressed, how they thought of, Islam as something that linked them to a different place.
And then, correct me if I'm wrong, later there's the Nation of Islam. That comes in later? Or?
Well, the Nation of Islam is founded in the 1930s. And in between the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, there's also a very important organization called the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam, which was a South Asian-based missionary movement, which sent a missionary or a number of missionaries to the U.S. and wound up converting great numbers of African Americans. Now, this was the movement.
From India?
Yeah, they were based in. They were a South Asia-based movement, and this movement, the Ahmadiyya movement, wound up being the organization through which a lot of the most prominent jazz musicians converted to Islam, such as Ahmad Jamal, Yusuf Lateef, McCoy Tyner. So very well-known musicians kind of all came in contact. Dizzy Gillespie talks about it in his autobiography. Like all these musicians are converting to Islam, and they're all doing so through the Ahmadiyya movement.
And the figures you've mentioned so far, the jazz music, they're all men. What about women in the organization?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question. So that's the focus of a lot of my research and scholarship right now, because, again, as you know, or as you might guess, it's very difficult to find records and archives and traces of African American women's lives, from the early 1900s on, and especially in the context of sort of quote-unquote fringe religious movements, such as, Islamic movements then. So women were actually some of the very first converts to all of these movements. So if you start looking at the literature and scholarship, you'll find that Clara Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad's wife, was actually the one that took him to the first meeting to hear this gentleman, W.D. Farad, speak, because she was drawn to this message, right?
How do you find these things? Are there diaries?
Well, there is some scholarship about it. There are still people in the community who have kind of verbal accounts of it.
So a lot of this is oral history.
A lot of it is oral history. I'm trying to get in touch with a lot of early African American women in the Ahmadiyya movement who talked about, how they were in communication with missionaries in Pakistan and India, and how that kind of flow of exchange happened, and how they started traveling to India in the 1950s and 60s, which was unheard of for African American women. But women were actually very strong in these communities. They took charge of the education of the children. They organize study groups. They help build institutions. And these types of things, you know, food, child rearing, family organization, these things were so central to what African American Muslims were trying to do. They were trying to rebuild their communities. So women were really central to this.
So, putting together everything you've been saying, it sounds like Black American Islam is almost its own thing. It's not exactly conventional Islam.
Well, you know, that's how people kind of frame it a lot. And so what I argue instead is that, well, Islam, there's a saying, you know, in the hadith, or I think it's one of the sayings, traditional sayings in Islam, is that Islam is like clear water. You know, it kind of reflects whatever culture it's placed in, right? And so people will say, oh, well, that's not Islam, what these African Americans were practicing. And so the argument against that is to say, well, this was their interpretation of it as it spoke to them in that particular moment. And they were practicing Islam. They called themselves Muslims.
So it's not entirely different from Islam is different in North Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia, so we would expect it to be different.
Exactly, and had its own particular historical roots and trajectory that is distinctively American, and which is distinctively and specifically connected to Black American communities. And so that's the argument I make about understanding Islam post 9/11 as well, that you have to understand this history in order to understand the present and how we as Americans look at Muslims and think about Islam.
And we've been talking about the Great Migration and Chicago and Detroit. How can we work New Jersey into this?
Sure, of course. Well, you know, so one of the kind of primary ways in which people came to know Islam during the Civil Rights era, which is very interesting, is through the Black Arts Movement. Which was a very prominent kind of cultural movement in which Black nationalists...
In the 60s.
In the 60s, so I'm kind of fast forwarding
that's
here,
okay.
Right? But one of the founders of the Black Arts Movement was Amiri Baraka. All right?
Okay.
So even his name, Amiri Baraka, was a name that he took on. He converted to Islam for a period. He unconverted. He you know, left Islam later on, but he converted to Islam. And if you look at interviews with him as he was kind of developing the Black Arts Movement and thinking about how to create a language of Black nationalism and Black individualism and Black power through the arts, through plays and stuff, he was speaking as a Muslim, and he was talking about Islam as a way towards Black freedom at that time. And he was based, of course, as we all know, poet laureate of New Jersey, based in Newark. And Newark has an incredibly vibrant, still and large population of African American Muslims. And I think his son, I can't remember his name, Amiri Baraka, who's a councilman, I think, in Newark. They have a huge kind of Eid celebration, which is one of the big holidays for Muslims. They have it outside. It's a huge prayer service. I mean, I'm getting, you know, learning about this too as a kind of transplant to New Jersey. But there is this very rich community. And we haven't kind of transitioned into talking about post-1965 and the way that immigration changed the Muslim community as well, but that's had a huge effect on New Jersey as well.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but prior to 1965, it was based on national origin. After 65, it was more on occupational skills.
Well, yeah, 1965 was the passage of the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, which lifted all the quotas that had been placed on different countries in Asia and the Middle East for decades. And so with these quotas lifted, there was suddenly all these, there was many more ways for immigrants to enter the United States, family reunification, professional class of workers, etc. So suddenly after 1965, you have huge numbers of immigrants coming from South Asia and a lot of Middle Eastern countries as well. And this dramatically changes the composition of who is Muslim in the United States, because prior to that, the only Muslim anyone can name, usually when you say, you know, prior to 1965, is Malcolm X.
Yeah.
right? And they don't even kind of associate that with what Islam is post 9/11. You know, that he just seems like an African American political leader. So post 1965 is when that changes. The demographics change.
And we do have some very visible mosques in our area.
Absolutely.
Yeah. On Route 1, you have the Islamic
South,
Society of Central Jersey.
It's beautiful, yeah. And there's a lot of beautiful mosques. And so you have in New Jersey now a really large South Asian population. I mean, you have Edison, Oak Tree Road, you know, where you can go and pretty much find anything. You can find clothing, you can find food, you can from South Asia. You know, just whether Muslim, whether Hindu, you can find halal food. It's plentiful. Halal is like kosher for Jews, is halal for Muslims. You can find halal butcher shops. You can find halal pizza. You can find all these things in New Jersey. So I mean, this is definitely a state in which this population is present in these different historical forms. I mean, in Newark, you have Amiri Baraka and this African American kind of presence of Islam, and then you have these immigrant communities that are creating these enclaves all over the state. So it's very vibrant in New Jersey.
Jumping ahead, September 11, 2001, what was the impact nationwide in New Jersey from your researches?
Right. Well, 9/11, I like to say that 9/11 was not a day that quote unquote changed everything, because I feel like a lot of the things that were happening to Muslim communities, Muslims and Arabs, were already things that were happening already. You know, like in the 1970s, we had a lot of conversations around oil sheikhs and, the oil crisis. And there were already these stereotypes of like dirty Muslims. And we had the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis in 1970. So you already had these images of the fanatic and all these types of things. But what 9/11 did was it shone a very bright spotlight on Muslims in the United States, which had never been shown before. It had always been thought of something over there, far away, these people and their, weird ways and their foreign kind of, customs. But that kind of, again, brought it home, right? So those images were already there, these kind of Orientalist image of oppressed women and, misogynistic men and all these types of things. They were already there. But what 9/11 did was spotlight the communities in the United States so that, A, there was much more racial violence directed at those communities after 9/11, which in turn led to Muslims themselves having to explain themselves and put themselves out there as a kind of collective group, because that's what you have to do to create create community and create safety for your community. So that's what happened.
Yeah, I remember a very heartwarming story. I think in the week after 9/11, the mayor of Morristown, realizing that this backlash was occurring, he rounded up all the prominent citizens of Morristown to all go out to dinner at the Afghan restaurant in Morristown.
Oh, yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Did you yourself feel any discrimination after 9/11?
I mean, if you look at me,
you look Chinese.
Nobody would read me as that. But I mean, I definitely heard about incidences from friends. I did have one incident where I was dressed for Eid, which is the big major holiday, the Eid al-Fitr, the one that's at the end of Ramadan, which is 30 days of fasting. And so I was wearing more traditional clothing. I was there with my family, and I was there with my daughters, and I was in San Jose, California, which is where Silicon Valley is. So there's a huge Asian population there. It's not by any means strange to see Muslims there, but I was walking in the street with my daughters, and I had a man roll down his window and scream that I should get out at me and my children, at that time 3- and 5-year-old children.
Wow.
And so that I don't think is anything out of the ordinary. I also have
it's still hurtful.
It's very hurtful, but I mean, but I don't want to say that that's all that there is. There's also, people are incredibly kind, and I've heard of really amazing stories of people, supporting their neighbors and helping each other out as well. So this is, this is all part of the landscape right now.
Do you ever feel like Muslims are sometimes unfairly targeted by law enforcement?
Oh, well, absolutely. That's something we can talk about in the context of New Jersey as well, because right here at Rutgers in New Brunswick, you had a very kind of well-publicized case of the Muslim Student Association at Rutgers, who I've worked with. They're great kids, very funny, very cool, cool kids, and I did an event with them last year, and they were targeted by the NYPD. Spied upon. Do you remember?
Yeah. Coming back
and then so the NYPD, not even the New Jersey police, sent undercover agents into Rutgers and just kind of hung out at these kids' events, and they were like canoeing and things like that. And so they were being surveilled, and it just kind of boggles my mind.
I think there was a backlash, and there's now a law on the books that out-of-state agencies have to register before.
I think that probably maybe was connected to that, because I think the president of Rutgers was angry that the NYPD would be in their jurisdiction like that. So
other controversial issues, I know in France it's been a big deal. Not allowing people to wear the headscarves, so women not allowed to wear headscarves in school. Has that been an issue in the U.S. too?
Right. Well, again, that's the very interesting thing that I said, Islam sort of reflects, and how people look at Islam sort of reflects the place where it is. And so in France, you have this absolute separation of church and state, kind of a very staunch notion of that, where that, it comes out of that history, that revolutionary history in France. Whereas in the United States, religious freedom is so central to kind of our nation's way of thinking about religion, that hasn't really been an issue within the U.S., like wanting women to take off their hijabs or forcing them to, though there have been many isolated incidents. So, there has been something in the news where a woman had a lawsuit against this clothing company, Abercrombie & Fitch, because they fired her because she refused to take off her hijab. And she'd been working there for a year, and she was a model employee, and then, they asked her to take it off, and she didn't, so they fired her. So she filed a lawsuit. So there have been a lot of cases like that. And there's also a lot of, kind of misperception and stereotype around women who wear the veil, kind of why they do it, and what that means, and they're oppressed and their husbands are beating them and all these types of things. I mean, there's a lot of that for sure.
And the whole issue of holidays in schools, like in East Brunswick, are Muslim holidays observed by East Brunswick Public Schools?
They're not observed, but the district does have a list of permissible holidays.
Oh, okay.
So, you'll have Diwali or Eid or all these holidays where if your child is celebrating these holidays, they can have an excused absence.
So that's an accommodation?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. They send out this list to say these are the accommodated holidays.
Well, Sylvia, I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us, and I think we've all learned a great deal.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.